Hello everyone. History tends to make big events sound inevitable, but the truth is many hinge on details so small you'd miss them if you blinked. The death of empires doesn't always begin with grand speeches or armies on the march. Sometimes it's just a driver who doesn't know the streets. Before we dive in, please like this video and subscribe to join our global community no matter where you are. Then drop your city and local time in the comments, because your voice makes our story complete. Dim the light. Let a soft breeze whisper around you, and settle in. Our journey into history begins now. You're in Sarajevo, June 28th, 1914. The summer air is warm, but there's a taut quiet in the streets. Bosnia has been under Austro-Hungarian control for only 6 years. The visit of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is supposed to be ceremonial. Parades, speeches, photographs for the papers. But everyone involved knows the city is uneasy. Security is thin. The motorcade route was printed in newspapers days before, which means anyone with a grievance can plan where to stand. Local police are briefed about possible trouble, which is the kind of phrase that makes everyone relax just enough to be caught off guard. The cars line up outside the station. Big, open-topped Graf and Stift touring cars, polished and obvious. The Archduke rides in the second car with his wife Sophie, both dressed formally despite the heat. It's the sort of scene that looks controlled from a distance. Up close, it's mostly people trying to keep their hats from blowing off. Along the route, 7 men have scattered themselves, each carrying either a bomb or a pistol. They're young, committed, and most importantly, nervous. The first attacker sees the convoy, pulls out a grenade, and throws it. It bounces off the folded roof of the Archduke's car, rolls under the next vehicle, and explodes, wounding officers and spraying shrapnel into the crowd. The convoy speeds away toward the town hall. At the podium, the mayor begins the standard welcome speech, but Franz Ferdinand interrupts him, still courteous but openly irritated, about bombs on a Sunday morning. Then they shake hands and get on with it. It's decided they'll visit the hospital next to see the wounded from the attack. A new route is planned to avoid the city centre. It is a sensible adjustment, except for one thing. No one confirms the lead driver knows about it. The update is scribbled on paper in a language the driver reads poorly. When they pull away from the town hall, the driver turns right, following the original plan. A guard shouts that they're going the wrong way. The driver brakes hard, stalls briefly, and begins to reverse. On the sidewalk outside a delicatessen stands Gavrilo Princip. He had been part of the earlier failed attack and had given up, stepping into the shop to buy a sandwich. Now the Archduke's car has stopped, just meters away from him, engine idling. Princip drops the sandwich, steps forward, and fires 2 shots. One into Sophie's abdomen, one into Franz Ferdinand's neck. The crowd freezes. The smell of burnt powder drifts in the warm air. Sophie dies almost instantly. The Archduke survives long enough to whisper to her not to die, repeating it until his own voice fades. Within minutes, both are gone. Back in Vienna, the news is treated not as a criminal act, but as state-level provocation. Austria-Hungary issues a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. Russia moves to protect Serbia. Germany supports Austria-Hungary. France and Britain join through their alliances. In just over a month, the First World War has begun. 4 years later, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is gone, along with the German, Russian and Ottoman empires. It's a chain reaction so vast that it's tempting to imagine it was unavoidable, but at its core is a tiny mechanical detail, a wrong turn and a stalled car. There's a strange piece of trivia here. The Archduke's car continued in use for years, changing owners. It was reportedly involved in multiple crashes, killing at least 7 people, and earning a reputation as cursed. Some owners tried to repaint or modify it, but the superstition lingered. Whether or not the curse was real, it's the kind of story that sticks, because it's easier to blame a car than the politics of an empire. And then there's the quieter absurdity. The fact that the man who changed the route forgot to speak to the man holding the wheel. It's the sort of clerical misstep that would normally cause nothing more than a missed meeting. In this case, it changed the map of Europe. Sarajevo's trams began running again within hours. Shops reopened. People went back to buying bread, mending clothes, minding their children. But the machinery of alliances and mobilizations had already started grinding forward. You could walk those same streets a week later, and never guessed they had been the starting line for a war that killed millions. The next time history turns on something small, it won't involve a car at all. It will ride on the wind, cross an ocean, and enter a city built on water, where it will empty homes without breaking a single door. Picture this. You've just stepped into Tenochtitlan in the summer of 1520. Not just any city, but one that sits right in the middle of a lake, connected to the mainland by 3 causeways so wide you could march an army across them. Canals cut between neighbourhoods. Markets overflow with maize, cacao, fish and obsidian. About 200,000 people live here, making it one of the largest cities in the world. At its centre, the Templo Mayor rises above the city, a constant reminder that politics and religion share the same address. Life before the Spanish follows a pattern. Tribute arrives from across the empire, priests oversee rituals to keep the gods satisfied, and the ruling council manages a complex web of alliances and conquests. It's stable in the way only an empire at its peak can be, confident, but maybe a little too confident. In 1519, Hernán Cortés arrives on the Gulf Coast with around 500 soldiers, a few cannons, horses, and a gift for political disruption. He allies with indigenous groups like the Tlaxcalans, who see the Aztecs less as neighbours and more as the people who demand too much maize every year. By November, Cortés is in Tenochtitlan. Emperor Moctezuma II receives him with formal hospitality. The Spanish live in the palace, technically as guests, practically as armed occupiers. Tensions grow. The Spaniards want gold, religious conversions, and a seat at the political table. The Aztecs want them gone, without open war. Neither side gets exactly what they want. In June 1520, Moctezuma dies. Whether at Spanish hands or during a riot is still argued over. His successor, Cuitlahuac, takes a harder line. Fighting erupts. On June 30th, the Spaniards flee during La Noche Triste, losing men, weapons, and much of the gold they tried to carry. Some of it sinks into the lake, where, according to later reports, no one bothers to retrieve it for months, possibly because swimming while wearing armour is less than ideal. The Aztecs regroup. They believe they can push the invaders out for good. But in late summer, another enemy arrives. Smallpox. It comes with a separate Spanish force led by Pánfilo de Narváez, sent from Cuba to arrest Cortés. Among his men is an African man carrying the variola virus. When these troops join with Cortés's forces and indigenous allies, the disease begins to move inland, quietly, invisibly, and far faster than any army. In the Americas, no one has immunity. The first cases are puzzling. Fever, pain, a rash that turns to pustules. Families care for the sick, unknowingly passing it along. In Tenochtitlan's dense neighbourhoods, it spreads through entire households in days. Priests can't keep up with funerals. Fields go unharvested. Food stalls close. Some markets stay open, but sell nothing, because appearances still matter, even when you have no goods. Aztec sources describe the suffering in plain terms. People too weak to move, covered in sores, dying of thirst when no one could bring them water. The social structure starts to fray. Tribute stops coming in. The army loses not just soldiers, but also the commanders who knew how to organise them. Cuitlahuac himself catches smallpox and dies after only 80 days as emperor. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, is young, brave, and inherits an empire in crisis, epidemic in the capital, enemies gathering outside. When Cortés returns in 1521, he's not alone. He brings fresh Spanish reinforcements and tens of thousands of indigenous allies. Many Aztec warriors are gone, and survivors are weakened. Crops have failed in parts of the empire. Hunger and fear spread, along with the disease. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasts 93 days. Spanish brigantines patrol the lake, cutting supply lines. The causeways are blocked. Starvation joins smallpox in killing defenders. By the final weeks, resistance is desperate. Arrows against cannon fire. On August 13th, 1521, Cuauhtémoc surrenders. Spanish chroniclers call the epidemic a gift from God. It's one way to describe thousands of pustules. Aztec records see it as disaster beyond anything in living memory. Modern estimates suggest hundreds of thousands died across central Mexico within the first year, many in regions the Spanish hadn't even reached yet. Some historians believe that without smallpox, the Aztecs could have held out for years, forcing a negotiated peace. Others think Cortez's alliances and technology would have won eventually. What's certain is that the epidemic turned a hard fight into a swift collapse. In normal times, death in Tenochtitlan follows strict customs. Families prepare the body, offerings are placed to guide the soul, and priests perform ceremonies at the temple. During the epidemic, these customs start to break down. Too many die too quickly. Some families bury their dead in shallow graves near their homes, simply because there is no one to help carry them to the temple. Others leave bodies wrapped in mats at crossroads, hoping priests will collect them when they can. There are accounts of priests moving from house to house, chanting the necessary prayers in the doorway without entering, partly to save time, partly to avoid infection. Markets shift. Stalls that once sold food or clothing begin selling clay pots for broth, bundles of herbs, and charms said to ward off illness. Some merchants raise prices, though with half the population gone, business isn't exactly booming. The social order changes in smaller ways. With many nobles dead, some commoners take on responsibilities they never expected, organising defence, managing tribute, or speaking in council. But these changes are temporary. When the siege begins, survival takes priority over politics. Aztec chronicles record these months with unusual bluntness. Whole neighbourhoods listed as empty, tribute records struck through, temple rosters missing entire groups of attendants. No dramatic flourishes, just absence. For the Spanish, the epidemic is background noise to their campaign. For the Aztecs, it is the main story, one that overshadows battles, diplomacy, and even the eventual fall of the city. Looking back, the siege and the epidemic blend into one event. But in the middle of it, there was a moment, maybe a few weeks, when the city still believed it could recover if only the sickness stopped. It didn't, and in some quiet street ledger, the price of maize drops sharply. Not because the harvest was good, but because too few people are left to buy it. In the early 16th century, the Inca Empire stretches down the spine of South America, from modern-day Colombia in the north to Chile in the south. At its height, it covers thousands of kilometers of mountains, valleys and coastline, all connected by a network of roads so well built that parts of it are still in use today. The capital, Cusco, is both the political and spiritual heart of the empire. Ruling this vast territory is Huayna Capac, the Sapa Inca. His word is law. His armies are disciplined, his engineers can build roads across cliffs, and his administrators can collect tribute from people living weeks away on foot. The empire isn't perfect. There are rebellions to suppress and territories to pacify, but it's stable. Then, sometime between 1525 and 1527, something strange begins. Reports of a sickness come from the north. It spreads quickly, moving along the same roads that make the empire so efficient. No one knows exactly where it starts, but historians suspect it's smallpox or a similar European disease introduced by early Spanish contacts moving through Central America into the Andes. For the Inca, it's entirely new. There's no immunity. The symptoms, fever, sores, weakness, are unfamiliar and frightening. The disease moves faster than news of its arrival. Villages lose whole families in weeks. The Empire's complex relay system of runners starts delivering more bad news than tribute records. Think of it as the first postal service where you hope the mail doesn't arrive. Huayna Capac himself contracts the illness while in the north, possibly near Quito. He dies, along with his designated heir, Ninan Cuyochi. The double loss is a political nightmare. Succession in the Inca system isn't strictly hereditary. The new Sapa Inca must be chosen from the royal family, ideally with the blessing of both the nobility in Cusco and the powerful generals. Without a clear heir, the empire faces a dangerous question. Who rules now? Two claimants emerge, Huáscar, based in Cusco, and Atahualpa, based in Quito with the Northern Army. At first, diplomacy is attempted, messages are sent, demands are made, accusations follow. Within a short time, the empire is at war with itself. The civil war is brutal. Atahualpa controls the battle-hardened forces of the north. Huáscar commands the south, including the administrative heart of the empire. Campaigns move up and down the Andes, armies clashing in mountain passes, valleys and riversides. Cities switch allegiances. Nobles bet on whichever side seems likely to win. some of them changing sides so often they could have applied for loyalty cards. By the early 1530, Atahualpa gains the upper hand. His generals are skilled, his troops disciplined, and Huasca's forces suffer defeats in the field. Eventually, Huasca is captured, and Atahualpa effectively becomes the ruler of a reunited but badly weakened empire. This is the moment Francisco Pizarro arrives. Pizarro, with fewer than 200 Spaniards, lands on the coast in 1532. By European standards, it's a tiny force. By Inca standards, it's barely a military escort. But Pizarro knows the timing is perfect. The empire is exhausted from years of civil war. Loyalties are fractured. Local resentment against Cusco's rule still simmers. Atahualpa, confident after defeating Huasca, agrees to meet Pizarro in Cajamarca. The meeting is framed as diplomatic. It ends with the famous ambush, Spanish cavalry and firearms cutting down unarmed Inca nobles. Atahualpa taken prisoner. In fairness, nothing says good first impression, quite like kidnapping the host. From there, the Spanish hold the Sapa Inca hostage, demanding gold and silver for his release. The ransom is paid, rooms filled with treasure, but Atahualpa is executed anyway in 1533. The empire, already destabilized, begins to fracture completely. In normal times, the death of a Sapa Inca is a full-scale production. Mummification, elaborate processions through Cusco, offerings stacked high enough to feed a small province, and the ceremonial installation of the next ruler. People line the streets, not just to watch, but to make sure the gods notice the effort. But when Huayna Capac dies, things don't go according to script. There's debate over where his body should rest. Cusco, the political heart of the empire, or Quito, the base of his last campaigns. The argument isn't just about geography. It's a preview of the split that's about to tear the empire in two. And with the epidemic still moving through the population, the ceremonies are rushed. Fewer attendants, fewer offerings, fewer musicians to play the traditional songs. In some places, the conch shells still sound, but there's no crowd left to hear them. Even outside the royal circles, life bends under the strain. Labour systems falter when whole communities are sick. Relay runners wrap messages in cloth to keep the sickness in. A kind of early hazmat theory that doesn't work, but makes people feel better. Some temples close, not because the priests have lost faith, but because there's no one left to sweep the floors. Proof that even divine service runs on basic maintenance. By the time Pizarro takes Cusco in 1533, the empire is politically conquered, but in many regions disease had already done the conquering years earlier. Fields lie untended, storehouses stand half empty, and the once efficient road system is used more for moving refugees than tribute. Spanish accounts later frame the conquest as a triumph of strategy and faith. Inca oral tradition remembers it as a chain reaction, an illness no one understood, the loss of a ruler, brothers at war and strangers arriving at exactly the wrong, or right, moment. Somewhere in a forgotten storeroom in Cusco, a scribe probably recorded the official cause as political instability. It's neater than writing. We were busy fighting ourselves when 168 armed tourists showed up. It's early 1066, and you're living in a kingdom that's about to become the hottest real estate in Europe. King Edward the Confessor has died without a direct heir, which in medieval politics means one thing. The throne is basically a free-to-a-good-home ad, and every ambitious man with a claim and an army is suddenly knocking. Harold Godwinson, your most powerful noble, gets himself crowned king almost immediately. Some people cheer, others start sharpening their swords. Across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, claims Edward promised him the throne. In Norway, King Harald Hardrada insists there's an old treaty that makes him the rightful ruler. And for extra family tension, Harald's own brother Tostig is siding with Hardrada. You get the feeling this year is going to involve a lot of marching. September rolls around, and Hardrada makes the first move. He lands in the north with 300 ships, wins a quick victory at Fulford, and starts setting up shop near York. You're down in London with Harold when the news arrives. There's no time to negotiate. The king orders a march north, roughly 300 kilometres in 4 days. Now, if you've never done a medieval forced march, imagine running an ultra-marathon while carrying your kitchenware, your bed, and a small metal door strapped to your chest. You sleep in open fields, eat what you carry, and hope your boots last longer than your knees. By the time you reach York, you're not feeling battle-ready, you're feeling ready for bed. The enemy, however, isn't ready for you. On September 25th at Stamford Bridge, you and Harold's forces catch the Norwegians off guard. Many have left their armour on their ships, expecting peace talks, not a fight. The battle is brutal. At one point, a single Viking holds the bridge for far too long, until someone figures out you can poke him from underneath. By sunset, Hardrada and Tostig are dead, and only a couple dozen ships are needed to carry the survivors home. It's an incredible victory. You want a feast, maybe a week of rest, and everything changes. Laws, land ownership, even the language spoken at court. You can still be a noble, of course, as long as you speak French, and don't mind giving your old castle to someone named Guillaume. Looking back, you can see it. The victory at Stamford Bridge came at a cost you couldn't afford. You were already worn down before Hastings even started. William didn't just fight a battle. He fought a battle against an army that had already done its big sprint for the year. Maybe if Harold had waited, fortified London, or forced William into a longer campaign, things would have been different. But in medieval politics, nobody wins glory by waiting. And history doesn't remember the fights you avoided, it remembers the ones you lost. Weeks later, walking through a village along the old march route, you overhear someone asking why the king's army ran up north, ran back south, and then disappeared. You keep walking. There's no easy way to explain that the whole thing made sense at the time. It's 1588, and you're on the deck of a Spanish galleon, a ship so massive and ornate it feels less like you're at sea and more like you've stepped into a cathedral that just happens to float. King Philip II has decided that England, currently ruled by Elizabeth I, is due for a regime change. Officially, the goal is to bring England back to Catholicism. Unofficially, it's also about settling personal grudges, punishing Elizabeth for supporting Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, and avenging the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Philip's plan is grand. Assemble the largest fleet Europe has ever seen, sail up the English Channel, join forces with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands, cross over to England, and install a new ruler. On paper, it's flawless. And, as you're about to learn, flawless on paper is just another way of saying, we forgot about the weather. The Spanish Armada is enormous, around 130 ships, over 30,000 men packed with soldiers, sailors and enough gunpowder to make the Channel glow if it all went off at once. Confidence is high. Spain has been dominating the seas for decades, hauling treasure from the Americas, smashing enemies in the Mediterranean. You feel invincible. You also feel slightly seasick. But that's not in the official reports. From the start, the English don't play fair. Their ships are smaller, faster, better suited for hit-and-run attacks. Instead of engaging in close boarding actions, the Spanish specialty, the English stay at a distance, peppering you with cannon fire, like an annoying wasp you can't swat. After a few days of this dance, you anchor at Calais to wait for Parma's army. That's when the English send in the fire ships, old vessels packed with tar, pitch and gunpowder, set alight and left to drift toward your anchored fleet. In the middle of the night, you see a wall of flames moving silently across the water. You cut anchor cables in a panic. Anchors are expensive, but being roasted alive is worse. Ships scatter in every direction. Morning comes, and the English attack at Gravlines. It's chaos, waves, smoke, splintering wood. The English get in close enough to punch holes in your hulls, then pull away before you can board. Your ship creaks like an old church in a windstorm. You start to think, maybe the Channel isn't your friend. After Gravelines, the decision is made. Sail north around Scotland and head back to Spain. That's when the wind turns from uncooperative to actively hostile. The so-called Protestant wind kicks in, gales that push you off course, into waters you don't know, toward coasts that don't want you. You skirt Scotland's rugged shoreline, then head south along Ireland. Storm after storm hammers the fleet. Some ships smash against rocks, others sink outright. Men die of disease, hunger and exposure. You've gone from a grand Catholic crusade to something that feels more like an endurance contest with the sea itself. The North Atlantic doesn't care about your royal orders. In Ireland, a few survivors make it to shore, only to be captured or killed by locals still angry about past Spanish interference. You watch from the deck as yet another galleon disappears under a wave, taking hundreds of men with it. The wind howls, the rigging groans, and you silently curse every optimistic admiral's speech you heard back in Spain. By the time you limp into Spanish ports, maybe 2/3 of the fleet makes it back. Philip calls the disaster God's will. The English call it divine intervention. You call it a reminder that maybe you should check the weather before trying to conquer an island nation. The strategic outcome is clear. The Armada fails, the invasion never happens, and England remains under Elizabeth. It's a turning point. Spain's naval supremacy takes a hit, and England starts to grow into the maritime power that will one day dominate the globe. The Protestant wind becomes a patriotic legend in England, a cautionary tale in Spain, and a convenient way for both sides to avoid talking about logistical failures. Looking back, you realise the fatal mistake wasn't assembling the Armada. It was assuming you could control the Channel and the North Atlantic, like they were placid lakes. You had the numbers, the guns, the will. What you didn't have was a fleet built for speed, or a plan B for when the weather decided it had an opinion. In taverns back in England, people are already retelling the story, how God sent the wind to save them, how Drake played bowls before the battle as if nothing was urgent, how the mighty Spanish Armada was scattered, like driftwood. It's a better headline than poor planning meets bad weather, but history always prefers something catchy. As for you, you remember standing on deck during those storms, soaked through, stomach empty, watching another wave crash over the bow, thinking, this was supposed to be easy. You think about the anchors cut loose in Calais, the friends lost in gravlines, the endless grey sky of the North Atlantic, and you decide, maybe the only real winner in 1588 was the wind itself. You find yourself in 1962, inside a control room that looks less like the bridge of a spaceship and more like the back office of a slightly disorganised bank. The paint is a shade of pale green that someone once called calming, though it mostly just reflects the flicker of the screens. Cables snake across the floor. There's a smell of burnt coffee. Every console has at least one paper cup with something cold and suspicious sitting in the bottom. This is NASA, but not the NASA of sleek documentaries. It's the one where people are running on 3 hours of sleep, shirts slightly rumpled, ties loosened just enough to look like they've given up on appearances. You're here for the launch of Mariner 1, America's big attempt to reach Venus before the Soviets do. The mission brief is straightforward on paper. Strap a probe to a rocket, send it into space, point it at another planet, and collect the glory. You watch the big countdown clock tick to 0, the engines flare, and the rocket begins its climb. It's smooth, at first. Voices around you are calm, clipped, just a bit too fast. Stage 1 separation confirmed. Guidance nominal. Correct for drift. You sip lukewarm coffee because that's what everyone else is doing. Then the numbers on one of the displays start doing things they shouldn't. They twitch. They spike. You're not sure if you should be concerned, but the guy next to you suddenly leans forward like he's trying to see something hiding behind the glass. Somewhere in the back of the room, a headset slips off someone's head and hits the floor. That's when you realise the room has gone from calm to the kind of quiet where every breath sounds loud. Here's the part you don't know yet. Somewhere in the thousands of lines of guidance code, a single hyphen is missing. Not a sentence, not a word, just a tiny mark, easy to overlook and impossible to spot unless you know exactly where to look. Without it, the guidance system is pulling raw, unfiltered data, panicking over every tiny fluctuation in the rocket's path, and overcorrecting like a nervous driver jerking the wheel every few seconds. From your seat, you can see the flight path curve just a little too much to the left, then back to the right, then left again. It's graceful in a way, but also the exact opposite of reassuring. Someone mutters wind shear under their breath. Another voice blames the booster. You don't yet know that the real problem is a typo. You just know that the room feels smaller by the second. At T plus 293 seconds, the decision comes in. Terse, absolute. Destroy the craft before it does something unpredictable. You watch as a coded command is sent. A few heartbeats later, a distant bloom of light appears in the sky. Officially, it's a controlled termination. Unofficially, it's $18.5 million worth of ambition, erased in less than a second. You don't cheer. Nobody does. There's a kind of flat acceptance in the room, as if everyone already knew this was one of those days. Later, the investigation will turn up the missing hyphen. The newspapers will seize on the story, calling it the most expensive dash in history. Engineers will pretend to laugh, but you'll catch that look in their eyes, the one that says they've replayed every step in their heads 100 times. And here's the thing, it's absurd, but also perfectly human. You can build a rocket across millions of miles of space, you can plot a trajectory with mathematical precision, but all of it still hinges on whether a typist's hand was steady that day. In that way, it's not so different from the rest of history. Grand designs collapse over the smallest details, whether it's a missing hyphen or an open city gate. Some people in this room will go on to design better checks for code. Some will insist on reading every line twice, even the ones they don't understand, just to catch a stray character. Others will develop strange habits, avoiding launches on days when the code review lands on a Friday, refusing to use pens that skip ink. Superstition is just another form of quality control. Years from now, you'll still hear the name Mariner 1 tossed around in meetings. It'll mean more than just a failed mission. It'll be shorthand for the kind of tiny mistake that's too small to see until it's far too late. You'll remember the coffee, the quiet, the moment when the arc of the rocket on the screen started to feel wrong. And maybe you'll wonder about the person who typed that line of code. Did they ever know it was their hyphen that went missing? Did they keep the story to themselves at parties? Or did they tell it, leaning back in their chair and letting people laugh in disbelief? Because there's a strange sort of immortality in being the one who proved typos can reach space. By the time the next missions fly, the Cold War race will pick up again, and Venus will eventually get its visitors. But in the quieter moments, you'll think back to that control room, and the lesson that hung in the air long after the smoke cleared. Technology may reach the stars, but it still trips over the smallest things. The next story isn't about missing marks in code. It's about a missing guard on a wall made of stone. You're on the inner wall of a medieval city under siege, and the days are starting to blur into each other. The air is heavy with the scent of damp stone, smoke from last night's fires, and the faint tang of boiled grain from the communal kitchens. Siege life is mostly waiting. You wait for the next attack. You wait for the food stores to run out. You wait for the messenger who never comes. People tell each other stories just to fill the time, but the jokes always end with a glance at the walls, as if to make sure they're still standing. From up here, you can see the enemy camp, a sprawl of tents and makeshift huts beyond the moat, banners hanging limp in the morning fog. They're close enough that you can hear the occasional clink of armour, the bark of orders, the thud of wood being chopped. They're patient. They know that the city's greatest enemy isn't their siege engines, it's hunger. The defenders have one great advantage. The gates are sealed, and the walls are high enough that even the most ambitious ladder looks like a bad idea. In this kind of war, the gates are sacred. They only open for two reasons: to let a patrol in, or to send one out. That's why the city uses a signal system from the inner watchtower. Bright flags in distinct colours to show when it's safe to open up. You've watched the process before. First, the returning patrol lights a small fire just outside bow range, signalling they're ready. Then the tower guard sends back the correct flag, one colour for friendly, open up, another for hold position, danger. It's simple enough to work even in bad weather, which makes what's about to happen all the more frustrating. The guard on duty this morning is younger than most, the kind who stands a little too straight in his armour. You can tell he's eager for something to happen, anything to break the monotony. The fog is thicker than usual, muting the colours of everything in sight. It's the kind of morning where even a red banner looks almost brown. Then you see it, a flag waving from somewhere beyond the walls. It's the all-clear signal, or at least it looks like it. You hesitate. The patrol isn't due back for another hour, but the guard has already taken it as gospel. He shouts to the gate crew, gesturing wildly, and the great wooden doors begin to creak open. From above, you can see the mud-slick ground where the hinges meet the earth, the heavy iron bolts sliding back. The gap widens just enough to fit two men side by side, and that's when you spot movement on the far side of the moat. Hooves, dozens of them. The enemy cavalry surges forward, no hesitation, no warning shot, just the pounding of hooves and the sudden gleam of lances in the mist. By the time the alarm bell rings, the first riders are already inside. The gate crew tries to reverse the winches, but once the enemy's in the courtyard, the geometry changes. You can't close a door around the people who are already holding it open. The defenders scramble. Arrows fly from the walls. hitting some of the riders, but more pour through the breach. The streets echo with the clash of steel, the panicked bray of mules in the market square, and the shouts of people who woke to find war in their front yard. Afterward, the explanations are as thin as the soup in the garrison kitchens. Some say the fog was to blame. The enemy had learned to mimic the flag's movements and used a shade of cloth just close enough to fool a tired eye. Others claim the guard simply wanted to be the one who saved the patrol by opening early. Officially, it's labelled a miscommunication, which in military language covers everything from dropped messages to catastrophic incompetence. The absurd part is how fast it happened. No siege towers, no battering rams, no week-long bombardment. The city fell in less than a morning because a man couldn't tell the difference between two pieces of fabric. You'd laugh if you weren't still standing in the wreckage. For the people inside, the change of power is instant but strangely anticlimactic. New banners go up on the towers. Tax collectors start visiting the markets with different seals on their ledgers. The language at the guard post changes, but the bread still costs too much, and the wells still smell faintly of iron. Life continues, just under different management. Weeks later, you'll still hear people debating whether the guard was a fool or just unlucky. You'll think about how easy it is to be both at the same time, and you'll remember that when people write about empires rising and falling, they rarely mention the man on the wall, squinting into the fog, trying to decide whether that blur of colour means open the gate or keep it shut. You file it away with all the other reminders you've collected. Fortresses don't fall to the tallest ladder, they fall to the smallest laps. And now, you're about to see what happens when the threat isn't a flag at all, but your own side firing at you in the dark. You're in the Austrian camp in 1788, and you can smell the war before you see it. Not the enemy, just the army itself. Damp canvas from the day's rain, sweat soaked into wool uniforms, and the sharp tang of iron from 100 unwashed muskets stacked near the tents. The Timis River flows sluggishly a short distance away, its surface catching just enough moonlight to look like a strip of dull metal laid across the dark. The war with the Ottoman Empire has been dragging on for months, but tonight there's no battle. The officers say you're holding position until orders come down from somewhere further up the chain, though no one seems sure where that chain actually leads. The men are restless. You've been marching and camping in cycles for weeks, and even in an army of tens of thousands, boredom is the one thing that spreads faster than disease. Somewhere out there, beyond the perimeter, your scouts are doing their work, slipping through the grass and mud, making sure the Ottomans aren't planning anything. You trust them to come back quietly, just as they've done before. But when they return tonight, they don't bring only news. They bring barrels, schnapps, strong, throat-burning, mind-blurring schnapps. Nobody asks where it came from. Some claim it was bought from locals. Others whisper it was liberated from a supply meant for another unit. Whatever the truth, the liquor starts making the rounds. Cups appear out of nowhere, hands pour generously, and the nervous stillness of the camp shifts into something louder, looser. You hear singing start at one fire, then laughter at another. A man stumbles into a tent rope, nearly toppling the whole thing, and somehow that's the funniest thing anyone's seen in a month. The officers frown but don't stop it. Maybe they think the men deserve a night to relax. Maybe they're just drinking too. That's when it happens. A shout from the darkness. The Turks! The Turks are here! No one checks. Why would they? The enemy's real. The war is real. And in the haze of drink and half sleep, the claim feels just as real as the ground under your boots. You grab your musket, join the rush toward the edge of camp, and see shapes moving through the fog. Muskets crack. The sound sharp and startling. The figures return fire and you take cover behind a wagon. Only later will you learn those enemy shots came from your own scouts, men returning late from their patrol, now convinced they've been ambushed. The confusion doesn't stop there. A group of infantry, hearing gunfire from the riverbank, assumes the enemy has crossed and charges toward it, straight into another Austrian unit doing the same from the opposite direction. Someone shouts orders, but the words are swallowed by the noise or twisted into new meanings. Hold the line becomes fall back. Flank them becomes they've flanked us. The cavalry gets involved next. They thunder through the centre of camp, convinced they're cutting off an Ottoman breakthrough. In reality, they scatter their own artillery crew who abandon their post to avoid being trampled. One of the wagons overturns, spilling ammunition into the mud. Another tips into the river. the splash so loud it convinces someone downstream that the Ottomans are landing boats. That rumour races through the ranks faster than any officer can stop it. You stay low as the chaos folds in on itself. Gunpowder smoke clings to the air, stinging your eyes and mixing with the sweet raw scent of spilled schnapps. The flashes of musket fire are so constant that it almost looks like dawn has arrived early. If dawn came with shouting, swearing, and the occasional scream of a startled horse, hours passed like this, shots fired at shadows, curses thrown at silhouettes, and the steady unravelling of whatever discipline the army had left. The few who try to find out what's actually happening are shouted down or simply ignored. No one wants to be the man who hesitated if the enemy really is out there. By the time the firing tapers off, the damage is done. The ground is littered with broken weapons, torn tents, and men who will never wake up. All of them wear your colours. The scouts, what's left of them, are furious, nursing wounds from the very people they were supposed to protect. Morning brings no comfort. The sky is grey, the camp is quieter than it should be, and the officers' faces are set in that grim expression that says they've already begun writing the official version of events. Words like misunderstanding and night confusion will appear in the reports. The schnapps might be mentioned, or maybe it won't. 2 days later, the Ottomans arrive. They don't need to attack with their full force. What they find is an Austrian army already battered, demoralised, and low on supplies they didn't have to fight for, because the Austrians had already destroyed or lost them in the night of panic. The ensuing battle isn't much of a battle at all. You think about the man who first shouted, "The Turks!" Did he really see something, or was it the drink talking? Did he know what he'd started? You'll never know. What you do know is that you've just witnessed an army lose to itself, and next, you'll see what happens when a commander's vague order sends cavalry charging into the wrong kind of glory. You're in Crimea, 1854, standing in a shallow valley that looks more peaceful than it has any right to. The grass is still green, the hillside soft with morning mist, and if you didn't know better, you might think this was just another quiet patch of farmland. But the guns on the ridges say otherwise. Russian guns, positioned in neat rows, already sighted down the length of the valley. You're part of the British cavalry, one regiment among several camped near the port town of Balaclava. The Crimean War has been dragging on, and today's orders are supposed to be simple: prevent the Russians from hauling away captured artillery from the heights. But simple orders don't stay simple once they start passing through multiple commanders. In the command tent, you're not present for the exact conversation, but the gist filters down to you in the form of a single, maddeningly vague command. Advance toward the enemy and stop them from removing the guns. No one specifies which guns. There are several sets of artillery in sight. The captured ones on the far ridge, the heavy Russian batteries at the end of the valley, and a few smaller emplacements scattered around. The order reaches your unit commander, Lord Cardigan, who doesn't question it. Maybe he doesn't want to look hesitant in front of his men. Maybe he assumes the officers above him have a clearer picture. You suspect it's a bit of both. Then the bugle sounds, and you're riding forward. The formation is tight, the horses restless, their breath steaming in the cold air. From your saddle, you can see the valley stretching out in front of you like an empty road, which would be comforting if it weren't flanked by high ground on both sides. The high ground where Russian guns are already loaded. Halfway down, the first shells hit. They tear through the formation with a sound like ripping cloth, except the cloth is made of metal and bone. Horses scream. Men vanish in sudden bursts of smoke and dirt. But the order was to advance, and so you keep riding, because that's what cavalry does when the bugle calls. It's only when you're close enough to see the cannon crews clearly, close enough to see them grinning as they adjust their aim, that you realise this is not the objective anyone in their right mind would have chosen. You're charging the wrong guns. By now, there's no turning back. The momentum of hundreds of horses is a force of its own, and the narrow valley offers no easy escape. You hear shouted orders, but the noise of battle swallows them. The only thing left to do is ride into the smoke and hope you can get out again. When you finally reach the Russian line, it's chaos. Sabres clash, pistols fire at close range, and the air is thick with the smell of powder and sweat. The charge punches through, then stalls, then turns into a desperate retreat, back down the same valley, under the same relentless gunfire. By the time you return to friendly lines, Half the men who started the charge are gone. Later, in London, the story will be told differently. The newspapers will write about the charge of the Light Brigade as a glorious display of bravery against impossible odds. They'll print Tennyson's poem, immortalising the ride in lines about honour and duty. The part about the unclear order will be smoothed over, as if the valley was always meant to be ridden into. But you'll remember it as something else entirely. You'll remember the confusion in the camp before the ride, the way no one quite knew which guns were the target, and the unshakable truth that you had been sent into the wrong valley for no reason that made sense to the men who had to ride it. Some say this is just how war works. Orders are imperfect, information is incomplete, and courage is sometimes just the act of following through on a mistake. You're not sure you agree, but you've learned one thing. History is kinder to disasters when you give them a good name. And next, you'll see how an empire's winter campaign fell apart over something as basic as counting coats. You're somewhere west of Moscow, 1812, and the wind doesn't just cut, it stays inside your bones. The air has that hollow metallic taste that tells you the temperature has dropped so far it's stopped bothering to snow. Every sound is sharper. Boots crunch on ice like glass underfoot. Breath freezes in the scarf you don't have, so you use your sleeve instead. The French army isn't marching anymore. It's limping. Once this was the Grande Armée. Hundreds of thousands of men, horses and guns moving like clockwork across Europe. Now it's a long, straggling line of figures bent forward under the weight of whatever they can carry. Victory has vanished from conversation. Now the talk is about survival until tomorrow. It wasn't supposed to look like this. The plan had been exact. Take Moscow quickly, force the Russians to sign terms and return to France before the real winter arrived. But the Russians refused to play along. They'd burned their own capital, carried away anything edible, and left nothing but empty streets and ashes. Napoleon had stood in the ruins of a city he'd meant to use as a bargaining chip, and realised it was useless to him. That was when the retreat began, and that was when the coat problem became real. On the supply lists back in Paris, it was neat and clean. Every soldier issued a winter coat, a blanket, proper boots. In reality, somewhere between the ink and the snow, the numbers had failed. Maybe it was bad counting, maybe theft, maybe the kind of rounding up that looks fine on paper, but turns lethal in practice. Whatever the cause, by the time the first snow fell, it was obvious that the army had far fewer coats than men who needed them. You're one of the unlucky. You've got your uniform and whatever scraps you found on the road. Around you, the makeshift solutions are equal parts desperate and absurd. A man in your unit has wrapped himself in a pair of velvet curtains, tassels dragging in the snow. Another wears a fur blanket so heavy he walks like he's carrying a door on his shoulders. Someone else has layered wallpaper under his tunic for insulation. When the damp gets in, the floral print peels away in curling strips. It's hard to say which is worse, the cold or the hunger. The bread freezes solid, so you break it with your bayonet and eat it in sharp, dry chunks. Horses collapse daily, too weak to pull the guns. Some are butchered for meat. Some are left where they fall, becoming frozen mounds along the roadside that no one has the strength to move. Every day the line gets shorter. Men sit down just to rest and never stand up again. No one talks much anymore, except to trade essentials. A real military-issue winter coat is worth more than gold. If you have one, you can bargain for food, a ride in a wagon, even a night of shared shelter from the wind. If you don't, you keep moving, because stopping means dying where you stand. The stories spread too. Some say the coats were stolen by corrupt quartermasters long before the campaign started. Others claim they were still sitting in warehouses back in France, safe and untouched, while their intended owners froze in Russia. There are darker rumours that some officers kept the supplies for their favourites, letting the rest fend for themselves. You don't know which to believe, and it doesn't matter now. By January, the retreat is less an army, and more a slow, scattered migration. The dead aren't buried, the ground is too hard. They're left along the path, frozen in place, uniforms stiff as wood. You stop looking at faces, it's easier that way. The living carry on wearing anything they can find. Sheepskins taken from villages, coats pulled from fallen comrades, scraps of upholstery tied around the waist. One man you pass is wrapped entirely in what looks like the stuffing from a mattress, the tufts of wool catching snow like a strange lumpy halo. The cold doesn't care who you are. Generals, aides, infantry. They all shiver the same. Even Napoleon's famed command style seems smaller now, as though the frost has frozen his words before they can warm anyone's resolve. The war that began as a march of empire has become a test of who can endure the weather the longest. Later the historians will talk about strategic errors, Russian tactics, the burning of Moscow. They'll analyse troop movements and battlefield maps. But you'll remember the empty crates. You'll remember the absurdity of a war brought low by someone's bad arithmetic. An empire's fate altered not by a battle, but by the absence of cloth in the right place at the right time. You keep walking, boots stiff, shoulders hunched. The thought lodged in your mind like an icicle. A few thousand coats could have changed this. Not won the war, maybe, but saved the men now lying frozen along the road. And next, you'll find yourself in a city protected by chains across the water. Chains everyone thought would hold forever, until they didn't. You're in Constantinople, and the day starts like any other. Market stalls are already clattering open, the smell of baking bread drifting in from the ovens, mingling with the tang of salt from the Golden Horn. Fishmongers shout about their morning catch, though everyone knows the best fish comes later in the day. Dockworkers haul crates while children dart between them, playing games no adult fully understands. If you lived here long enough, the chain is just part of the scenery, huge, solid, and always there. It stretches across the mouth of the harbour like a sleeping giant, anchored at both ends with stone and iron. You've heard people say with no small amount of pride that no enemy ship has ever crossed it. Some believe the chain itself has a sort of magic. Others just trust the engineers who forged it centuries ago. Either way, no one questions it. Why would they? It's worked for generations. That kind of thinking is comfortable, until the day it isn't. The truth is, the chain hasn't been properly maintained in decades, not because anyone set out to sabotage it, but because maintenance cost money and urgency is easy to ignore when nothing appears to be wrong. Somewhere in the city archives, dusty scrolls with red seals outline exactly which sections needed repairs, which links had corroded, which pins were loose. Those reports were read, nodded at, and then quietly shelved. The funds meant for repairs probably went into something more important that year. A festival, a new wing for a palace, maybe someone's cousin's business venture. The Ottoman fleet has been sitting just outside bow range for weeks. The standoff is so routine now that soldiers on both sides wave to each other in the mornings. Everyone assumes that when the attack comes, it'll be against the walls. The chain is a given, an unmovable constant in everyone's mental map of the city's defences, so when the lookout on the tower shouts that the Ottomans are coming through the harbour, people laugh. Ships can't get in that way. Everyone knows that. But then the masts appear. Not where they're supposed to be, not beyond the walls, but sliding gracefully into the Golden Horn as if the defenders had simply opened the gate and invited them in. From your position on the seawall, you see the chain, still floating, still technically there, just lying slack in the water. Rust has eaten through one of the anchor links on the Galata side, and what should have been a rigid barrier is now just a heavy piece of useless decoration. The enemy didn't even have to cut it. A few men with poles pushed it aside, and the gap opened like a curtain. Panic ripples through the city in real time. Dockworkers drop their ropes, fishermen pull in their nets, and vanish. Soldiers rush toward the waterline with crossbows and pikes, but the Ottoman ships are already inside, sails snapping in the wind, crews shouting to each other as they spread into the harbour. The defenders yell at one another about whose job it was to inspect the chain. Nobody has a satisfying answer. Later, when tempers cool, the blame moves in circles. The Treasury insists they allocated funds. The harbour guard swears they never saw the repair orders. The maintenance crews say they weren't paid. Everyone agrees the chain failed, but no one volunteers to be remembered for it. In the taverns, people tell their own versions of the story. Some say the chain was cursed, doomed to break when the city's fortunes turned. Others claim the Ottomans had a spy in the maintenance crew, paying him to forget certain jobs. The less dramatic explanation, that iron rusts and people procrastinate, doesn't satisfy anyone, though it's probably closest to the truth. The Ottomans don't waste their advantage. With the harbour open, they can land troops where the walls are weakest, cut off supply lines, and make the city's defenders fight in directions they hadn't planned for. It's not the instant fall of Constantinople, but it's a wound that will fester in the months to come, and you, standing there as the first enemy ship moors at a pier that had been safe yesterday, understand something important. Defences, no matter how strong, are only as good as the last time someone bothered to check them. A fortress might keep out 1,000 soldiers, but it won't survive one rusty chain. By evening, the chain is hauled ashore and dumped in the shipyard like a dead animal. People poke at it, surprised by how easily the rust flakes away. It's no longer a symbol of security, just a reminder of what happens when everyone assumes someone else is taking care of the problem. Tomorrow the city will wake up under a new kind of pressure, its enemy now anchored in the very waters that once defined its safety. And next, you'll watch another fortress fail, not because of rust, but because someone forgot that a road through the forest counts as a gate too. You're deep inside the Maginot Line in the spring of 1940, and it feels less like a fortress and more like a strange underground town. The air carries a constant mix of diesel fumes from the generators and the faint, ever-present damp of concrete that's been sweating for years. Pipes run along the ceilings like veins. Every corridor has the same echo, boots striking metal grates, voices bouncing just enough to make it sound like someone's following you. Life down here has a routine. You wake to the clanging of mess hall pans, shuffle in line for coffee so weak it could pass for dishwater, and try not to think about how many more months you'll be posted here. The officers call it the Shield of France. The men just call it the Mole's Palace. It's not that you doubt the Maginot Line. The forts are massive. The artillery positions look like they were carved by giants, and every gun faces the German border like a fixed glare. You've walked the top of the bunkers, looked out at the empty fields, and thought, if they come this way, we'll see them miles off. That thought is comforting, right up until it isn't. What you don't see from inside the thick walls is what's happening miles away, in the Ardennes. There's a narrow road there, small, winding, lined with pine and birch. It's the sort of road you might use for Sunday drives, or hauling hay from a farm. The maps in the officers' rooms have it marked, but in faint lines, as if it's an afterthought. Officially, it's unsuitable for tanks. That's what the paperwork says, and once it's written down in the right column, it becomes fact. So no guns are stationed there, no bunkers, no mines, no real defences. Why waste resources? The thinking is simple. If you've got a wall, you guard the wall. You don't need to guard the parts where nature already did the job for you. Except nature is not part of the chain of command, and the Germans know how to read a map too. While you're drilling underground, swapping cards in the rec room, their armoured columns are threading through that forest road like water through a crack. They're not attacking the Maginot Line, they're ignoring it. The first sign is a garbled radio message, too static-filled to take seriously at first. Enemy armour sighted behind French lines. It's absurd enough that the men laugh. Maybe the radio's backwards, someone jokes, but then the messages keep coming, and the laughter dies. Your commanding officer comes into the mess looking pale. The Maginot Line hasn't been broken. It's been sidestepped. The enemy is already pushing west. The forts are suddenly irrelevant. The big guns can't swivel to face the wrong direction. The corridors you've been living in might as well be buried treasure, for all the good they're about to do. Orders filter in with all the urgency of a slow leak. Some units are told to stay put and hold their positions, against enemies who aren't even there. Others are sent scrambling to redeploy, hauling what equipment they can carry, leaving the rest to gather dust in the dark. You stand on the observation deck one last time and look out toward the German border. The fields are still empty in front of you, but you know it's meaningless now. The war is unfolding somewhere else, beyond your reach, on that quiet little road through the woods that everyone decided not to worry about. Later, the history books will call it a failure of strategy. In the barracks, the men will call it something less polite. Some blame the politicians, others the generals, and a few just shrug. Because at the end of the day, the truth is painfully simple. Nobody put a barricade on a road that could have been blocked with a couple of felled trees. You think about the irony. Millions spent on a wall of steel and concrete, years of labour, a network of defences that could stop an army head-on, but couldn't do anything about the fact that armies have legs and wheels, and a talent for going around things. The Maginot Line didn't fail in the way people think. It worked exactly where it was built. The problem was that the war didn't come to where it was built. By the time the sounds of battle reach your ears from the west, the outcome is already shifting. You're left in the tunnels. the hum of the generators masking the faint, far-off rumble of tanks. Tanks that never once had to face the guns you've been living beside. Some say this is the lesson of every war. The next one always comes from a direction you didn't bother to look. Others just say, no wall is perfect if there's a side door. And next, you'll be standing in a banquet hall where the danger isn't an open road, but an open mouth, one mistranslated toast away from turning an ally into an enemy. You're in Rome, or at least what passes for Rome these days. The Empire's borders have shrunk. Its senators are more likely to debate grain tariffs than conquest. But the banquet halls still look like they belong to an age when legions ruled the known world. The marble under your feet is cool and smooth. Above, oil lamps sway gently, throwing golden light across the painted ceiling. The room smells of roasted lamb, spiced wine, and too many perfumes layered on top of one another. Outside, the city hums with its usual evening noise, distant wheels on cobblestones, a dog barking, the occasional burst of drunken laughter. But in here, it's all about ceremony. 2 nations have gathered tonight to toast an alliance. Not a casual handshake kind of alliance, but the sort with official seals and signatures, the kind that changes trade routes and military maps. This dinner is the final warm-up before the ink dries tomorrow. Your job? Translate every word perfectly so nobody ends up accidentally insulting anyone's gods, mothers, or naval fleets. You've done this before. You know both languages like you know your own heartbeat. You've translated tax negotiations, trade disputes, even one bizarre meeting about importing exotic birds. But tonight is different. Tonight there's wine. The kind of wine that's so smooth you don't notice how much you've had until you stand up and the floor tilts slightly. By the time the third course arrives, honey-glazed pheasant with a side of spiced figs, the host, a senator with a booming laugh and an appetite to match, decides it's time for a toast. He rises, goblet in hand, and begins in his native tongue, his voice rolling through the hall like a drumbeat. His metaphors are rich and sprawling, comparing friendship to rivers, alliances to olive groves, peace to the eternal hills. You're doing fine until that last one. Maybe it's the wine. Maybe it's his habit of running straight through clauses without breathing. Maybe it's that you're trying to follow his rhythm while a server leans over your shoulder with a platter of steaming bread. Whatever the reason, you swap one small word. May our alliance last as long as the eternal hills, he says. May our alliance last until the hills are destroyed, you say. It's only a difference of a few syllables, but the visiting delegation freezes like you've just told them their ships are on fire. The ambassador's goblet hovers halfway to his mouth. His aides glance at each other, the way people do when they're trying to figure out whether to laugh or start writing a warning back home. You realise immediately what you've done, but the senator is already lifting his drink in triumph. If you stop him now to correct yourself, you'll have to admit you've just wished geological annihilation upon the friendship of your 2 nations, and in front of 200 witnesses, so you pivot. You lean toward the ambassador and murmur that this is a local idiom, meaning until the end of time. You put on the most confident smile you can muster, like everyone says this all the time and you can't imagine why he looks concerned. He raises his eyebrows but drinks anyway, because declining a toast in this hall would be a bigger insult than any supposed threat about hills. The mood doesn't collapse, but it shifts. Conversation continues. Laughter still rises over the clink of cutlery, but there's a subtle edge now, like a faint smell of smoke in a room where no one can find the fire. You catch snatches of murmured debate in the visiting delegation. Was it a mistake? A coded warning? A test of loyalty? During the dessert course, a tray of candied almonds and dates stuffed with pistachios, you hear the ambassador ask his aide if hill destruction is some kind of Roman proverb for betrayal. The aide shrugs and says, "If it is, it's new to me." Later, as guests drift toward the antechamber, you see the 2 leaders exchange polite farewells that are just a little too formal, a little too stiff. You breathe easier when no swords are drawn. You breathe even easier the next morning when the treaty is signed, though not without a few pointed references in the speeches to foundations that will never be shaken. The war doesn't happen that week. Maybe not because of you. Maybe just because the wine was too good to waste on anger. But you make yourself a promise. Next time, no poetic flourishes, no clever phrasing. Just the plainest, most boring translation possible. And maybe, for safety's sake, less wine. You learn something that night. Alliances are like glass. They can be beautiful, they can be strong, but one clumsy movement and you've got a mess no one can clean up without cutting their hands. Next, you'll be watching a Viking crew learn a similar lesson, except theirs comes not from words but from water, when a wrong tide chart strands their ships and lets the locals steal them without a fight. Here's the thing about raiding. It's all about timing. You land fast, you take what you came for, and you get back to the ships before the locals have time to sharpen anything pointy. That's the unspoken rule every crew lives by. This raid had started like it came straight out of a saga. The longships cut through the morning mist, the oars worked in perfect rhythm, and the navigator, an old salt with a beard like a tangled net, promised, "We'll be back out before the sun's high enough to warm the sand." Everyone believed him. Why wouldn't they? The man had been reading tides since before some of the crew were born. The landing was easy. A few shouts from the village, a couple of arrows that landed more in mud than men, and then the locals scattered. Looting felt almost casual. Silver cups and carved bowls disappeared into sacks. One man carried off a sheep under each arm. Someone else found a chest of dried fish and declared it provisions in case the wind turned foul. It was all going perfectly. The mood changed when the crew crested the last dune before the beach. The ships were still there, sure. The sea, however, had moved on without them. The tide had pulled back so far that the longships sat in damp sand, leaning awkwardly like they were trying to listen to a conversation inland. The nearest water was a shimmering strip far, far away. At first, there was silence. Then a voice from the back asked, "So, is this part of the plan?" The navigator stared at the horizon, his lips moving as if rereading an invisible tide chart. "The moon's early," he finally said, which didn't explain much, but nobody was in the mood for astronomy lessons. Dragging the ships was discussed for about 30 seconds. A few tried to lift a bow, but the sand clung like it had been waiting years for this moment. The idea died quickly, so the crew did what they'd never done before: nothing. They set their loot down, leaned on their shields, and waited. That's when the audience arrived. First, 2 farmers appeared on the cliff above, just watching. Then more joined, dozens, until the ridge looked like a living fence. They didn't shout or throw stones. They just stood there, arms crossed, as if they'd been promised a free show. The Vikings tried to ignore them, which is harder than it sounds when your entire escape plan depends on an ocean that's currently missing. A suggestion to start singing met with a flat no after the first verse drew applause from the cliff. A few crew members decided to at least start mending a torn sail, but even that felt pointless. Every move was under watch. Eventually a group of locals made their way down. They didn't carry swords, just ropes, axes, and an air of quiet certainty. They walked right past the loot and inspected the ships, nodding to each other like merchants deciding which carts to buy. Then they began untying lines. The Vikings stepped in to block them, but more farmers appeared, spreading out in a slow, deliberate wall. There was no battle. No one was eager to spill blood here, and everyone knew who had the advantage: the people whose feet weren't stuck in a plan that had gone wrong. One small boat was pushed into a shallow channel and rowed away without a fight. Then another. The bigger ships were rolled up the sand on logs, the farmers working in smooth, practiced rhythm, ignoring every shouted threat. It was theft in broad daylight, and there was nothing to be done about it. By the time the tide returned, half the fleet was gone. The ships that remained were damaged, sails cut, rudders missing, one with a hole so neatly hacked it could have been framed as carpentry. The row back to camp was silent. No one blamed the loot, or the locals, or even the farmer's nerve. The target of all the quiet resentment sat at the front, the navigator staring ahead, as if maybe the moon would come down and apologise in person. Back at the Longhouse weeks later, the story turned into a favourite. Not because it was glorious, it wasn't, but because it was ridiculous. Men told it with more farmers, more missing ships, and with the detail that one stolen boat was loaded with their own stolen goat, bleating all the way into the distance. Everyone laughed, but the men who'd been there never laughed quite as loud. Above the main hearth, someone carved new words into the beam: "Check the tides twice." Nobody argued. Some said it was advice, others thought it was a warning. Either way, no one ever forgot the day the sea itself betrayed the plan, not with a storm, not with waves, but by quietly walking away and letting the locals do the rest. War offices are not glamorous. Forget the grand paintings of generals pointing at maps. Most of the time, it's just a room where paper comes in, paper goes out, and nobody smiles unless there's food involved. The air is heavy with the smell of stale tobacco, damp coats, and the faint permanent tang of ink. The people inside look like they've been slowly carved down by the war, faces lined not from battle but from endless hours of processing orders, receipts, and reports. You're one of them. You shuffle papers across your desk all morning. It's work that doesn't require much thought, just speed and the ability to stay awake. Somewhere near mid-morning you notice a telegram sitting in the wrong stack. It's folded, stamped and marked for high priority, but it's wedged between a shipment request for horseshoes and a maintenance order for a field kitchen stove. The timestamp says it arrived before dawn. You open it. 4 lines, blunt and clear, ceasefire agreed, effective immediately. You read it again. No flourishes, no qualifiers, no pending confirmation. Just stop shooting. Now. You glance around the room. Everyone else is hunched over their own piles of work. The officer at the front desk is busy dictating something about troop rations. The typist is swearing quietly at a jammed ribbon. You hold the telegram in your hand a little longer than you should, wondering whether to stand up and interrupt whatever is happening. Finally, you walk it over to the adjutant's desk. He reads it once, raises an eyebrow and checks the clock. Then he says flatly, "You're late." That's when you realise. Out there, at the front, the battle has already started. The guns are firing, troops are moving. Orders to attack were given hours ago. The adjutant doesn't rush to send a halt order. Instead, he rubs his face and mutters, "If we send this now, they'll think we've lost our minds." In a way, he's right. Imagine being a soldier halfway across the battlefield, charging forward under shell fire, only to be told the fight was never meant to happen. How do you even process that? The message does go up the chain, eventually, slowly, cautiously. And while the paper travels, men keep dying for no reason except that a piece of news took the scenic route. On the enemy's side, the same comedy is playing out. Their ceasefire telegram is also sitting in an office somewhere, unopened. By the time it reaches their field command, they're already returning fire, already losing men. Nobody wants to be the first to stop shooting. Nobody wants to look like the fool who believed a message that might be wrong. Hours later, both sides finally stop. Not because someone made a dramatic last-minute stand. Not because the generals agreed to meet under a white flag, but because the paperwork finally caught up with reality. The battlefield falls quiet in the kind of silence that feels more awkward than peaceful. There's no cheering, no handshakes, just a slow, trudging withdrawal from positions and the grim accounting of lives lost in a fight that, officially, didn't need to happen. In the days that follow, the incident is rewritten on paper. Reports use phrases like communication delays and logistical complications. Nobody writes the sentence that actually explains it. The telegram was there, it just wasn't opened in time. Inside the ministry, everyone moves on. There's always more work, but the story survives in the small talk between clerks and runners. Someone will lean on a doorway and say, "Remember that ceasefire we fought through?" And everyone will groan in the same tired, half-laughing way. And if you stick around long enough, you learn a quiet rule. No matter how boring or irrelevant a message looks, you open it. You open it right away. Because wars can hinge on a single piece of paper. And sometimes the thing that decides whether men live or die isn't bravery, strategy, or even politics. It's whether the right person reads the right words at the right moment. So you've made it through all 15. 15 little accidents, bad guesses, missed signals, and wrong turns that, in their own way, shaped history. None of them were planned. None of them came from some grand, flawless strategy. That's the thing. You've probably noticed it by now. Big moments don't always arrive with trumpets and banners. Sometimes they arrive because somebody forgot to check the tide, or read the wrong word, or let a piece of paper sit too long on a desk. You might have started this thinking history was all about bold leaders and careful plans. Now you know it's also about farmers rolling away your boats, generals getting directions they don't understand, and a hyphen that cost millions in space hardware. It's about people, messy, tired, distracted, overconfident, underprepared people, making choices that echo far beyond the room they were made in. And maybe that's the real takeaway. You can train for years, command armies, or run an empire, but you're still only ever one bad moment away from ending up in a story like this. The comfort. You're not likely to lose an empire because you left your email unread for a few hours. But the risk? Well, history says the smallest slip can open the biggest doors, and you never get to choose what walks through.